11 days before my daughter's wedding, she sent me a text message that ended with 6 words: "It's just easier if you're not there." She didn't know that the venue for her 200-guest wedding, the restored barn, the string lights, the pond her future in-laws had been bragging about for 6 months, was sitting on land I had owned for 11 years. She didn't know that I had built it, plank by plank, with my own 2 hands, in the 2 years after I buried her mother, just so I'd have somewhere to put all that grief. Nobody at that wedding was ever supposed to find out. I read her text 4 times, standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. Then I set the phone down very carefully, like it was something that might go off if I dropped it. And then I picked it back up and made one phone call. Not to my daughter, not to beg, not to cry, not to ask what I'd done wrong. I called my lawyer, and by the end of that week, there was no wedding venue left to uninvite me from. If you've ever been quietly phased out of your own family's plans, not with a slammed door, but with a soft, reasonable-sounding sentence that somehow makes you feel crazy for being hurt by it, stay with me to the end. What I did next isn't what you're expecting, and it's not something I'm proud of in the way you might think. It's something I'm proud of in a completely different way, and I think you'll understand exactly why by the time this is over. My name is Walter Grayson. I'm 63 years old. I've spent 22 years in real estate development. I've been a widower for 12 of them. And up until 11 days ago, I thought I had raised a daughter who knew without question that she'd never be small in front of anyone as long as I was alive. Let me back up. I lost my wife Carol when Emma was 19. Pancreatic cancer. 4 months from diagnosis to funeral. And I watched a 19-year-old girl become a woman in the space of a single spring. She dropped out of her sophomore year of college to help me. She sat with her mother every single day. She learned how to change a feeding tube because the home nurse could only come twice a week. She was, without exaggeration, the strongest person I have ever known. After Carol died, it was just the two of us for a long time. I worked construction and later real estate development. And I built something. Not overnight. Over 22 years of buying land nobody else wanted, fixing it up and holding on to it. By the time Emma finished her degree and moved to Charleston for work, I owned 6 commercial properties. One of them was an old dairy barn on 11 acres that I bought for almost nothing in 2015 and spent 3 years turning into an event venue. Exposed beams, a stone fireplace, a pond stocked with koi that I probably spent too much money on. I named it Grayson Hollow, but I never once put my name on the signage out front. I hired a management company to run the bookings, the catering coordination, all of it. I never showed up to weddings. I never wanted to be the venue owner guy, hovering at somebody's happiest day. I just liked driving out there sometimes in the evening, sitting by the pond and knowing I'd built something with my own 2 hands that made other people happy. Emma didn't know I owned it. Almost nobody did. My accountant knew. My lawyer knew. That was about it. I want to explain why I hid it, because it matters for everything that comes later. When Carol was sick, one of the last things she said to me, clear-headed near the end, was, "Don't let Emma grow up feeling like she owes you for surviving." She meant it kindly, but it landed on me like a job assignment. I took it seriously. I never wanted my daughter looking at anything good in her life and thinking, well, that's because of Dad's money, or Dad's name, or Dad pulling strings. I wanted her to build her own life and just happen, by coincidence, to walk into rooms her father built without either of us ever needing to mention it. It felt, honestly, like the purest form of love I knew how to give. Invisible, unconditional, asking for nothing back. Looking back now, I think that instinct, as good as it came from, is also part of what let things get as far as they did. Because nobody in that family knew who they were dealing with. Nobody could imagine that the quiet, soft-spoken widower in the ill-fitting blazer at the engagement dinner was sitting on more square footage of commercial property than the Ashfords had ever put their name on. I let them underestimate me for 2 years, and for 2 years it cost me nothing. Until it started costing me my daughter. Emma met Derek about 2 years ago. Good job. Seemed polite enough the handful of times I met him. Worked in finance for his family's investment firm down in Charleston. His parents, Richard and Bonnie Ashford, were what you'd call old money. The kind of old money that talks about old money a lot, which in my experience is usually new money wearing a nicer coat. The first time I met Bonnie Ashford, she asked me what I did for work, and when I said real estate, some development, she smiled this little smile and said, "Oh, how nice, hands-on work," in the exact tone you'd use to compliment someone's macaroni art. I let it go. People show you who they are slowly sometimes, and I've learned to just watch and wait. There was a second moment, early on, that I didn't think much of at the time, but that I've replayed 100 times since. At Emma and Derek's engagement party, Richard Ashford cornered me by the bar, a little too many drinks in, and asked me, genuinely, not even meanly, just carelessly, whether I'd managed to put anything away for retirement, given that construction work could be unpredictable. He said it in his tone people use when they think they're being generous by not embarrassing you further. I told him I was doing fine. He patted my shoulder like he was congratulating a child for finishing their vegetables. I didn't correct him. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that I didn't need strangers' respect, that Emma's happiness was the only thing that mattered. And that was true. But somewhere in there, without meaning to, I think I trained everyone around that family to believe I was someone who wouldn't push back. Somebody safe to overlook. The wedding planning started about 8 months ago. Emma called me, genuinely excited, and said she and Derek had found the most perfect venue, someplace called Grayson Hollow, about 40 minutes outside Charleston. She sent me pictures. I looked at pictures of my own pond on my daughter's phone screen and didn't say a word. Because at the time it felt sweet. She'd fallen in love with something I'd built without even knowing it. And I thought, well, maybe I'll tell her at the wedding. Maybe I'll tell her the whole story as a gift. Father of the bride walks her down the aisle at a place her daddy built with his own hands, and then reveals it during the toast. I actually cried a little thinking about that moment, alone in my truck, like an idiot. That's not how it went. Dope. The trouble started small, the way it always does. Bonnie Ashford wanted a 50-person guest list to become 200. Fine, more the merrier, I said. I'd help cover the difference even though nobody asked me to. Then it became about the seating chart, whether I should be at the immediate family table or somewhere further back because, and this was said to Emma, not to me, but Emma told me because at that point she still told me things, because Bonnie felt it would be confusing for the photos to have so many blended dynamics at the head table, given that I was a widower and hadn't remarried, and it might read as sad in the pictures. Read as sad. My grief, 12 years old at that point, packaged and assessed for its photographic value. I told Emma I didn't care where I sat. I have never cared about a seating chart in my life, but I noticed the tone of her calls changing. Less "Dad, what do you think?" and more "Dad, please just let this one go. It means a lot to Derek's family. 3 weeks ago, Emma called me crying. Not happy tears. She said there had been a fight. Bonnie had brought up in front of Derek's entire extended family at an engagement dinner that she found it unconventional that I would be walking Emma down the aisle alone, no wife on my arm, and wondered aloud whether it might be more balanced if Emma's aunt, my sister-in-law, a woman I've spoken to maybe 6 times in a decade, walked with me, so the aisle procession would look more complete. Emma had defended me. She told me that. She said she stood up at that dinner and said her father was walking her down the aisle alone because he raised her alone, and that was the end of it. I believed her. I still believe she meant it. But 11 days ago, I got a different phone call. Emma, quiet, careful, using that voice people use when they've rehearsed what they're about to say. She said that Derek's parents were paying for 80% of the wedding. She said that with the guest list where it was now, and given some of the tension, Bonnie had strongly suggested that it might be best for me to attend the reception only and skip the ceremony and the rehearsal dinner, that my seat at the head table had been reassigned to keep the day feeling cohesive, that it wasn't personal, that it was just easier. I asked her straight out, Emma, are you asking me not to walk you down the aisle at your own wedding? There was a long silence. Then she said, Dad, I don't want to fight about this right now. Can we just get through it? Get through it. Like I was a scheduling conflict. Like I was weather. I said okay. I said I understood. I hung up the phone and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I want to be honest about those minutes, because I think people romanticize moments like this. Imagine me pacing, shouting, throwing something. It wasn't like that. I sat at the same kitchen table where I used to help Emma with algebra homework, where Carol and I used to drink coffee on Sunday mornings before either of us said a word. And I just felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. Not rage. Something closer to clarity. The kind of clarity you get right before you make a decision you already know you can't undo. I thought about every seat I'd given up over the last 8 months without complaint. I thought about Bonnie Ashford's little comment about the head table reading as sad. I thought about Carol, who never once in 23 years of marriage let anyone make either of us feel small, and who would have had something extremely pointed to say about a woman suggesting her husband's grief needed to be seated further from the camera. And then I thought about the barn. My barn. The place I'd built with my own hands in the 2 years after I buried my wife, when I didn't know what else to do with my body except work, when digging post holes and setting stone was the only thing that let me sleep at night. 200 people were about to dance under a roof I put up myself, celebrating a version of family that had quietly decided there wasn't room in it for me, and then I called my lawyer. Uh, Here's what a lot of people don't understand about anger. Real anger. The kind that comes after a lifetime of loving someone and giving everything you have to them. It doesn't make you loud. It makes you very, very quiet. It makes you methodical. The angriest I have ever been in my life was the day I signed Carol's DNR paperwork, and I didn't raise my voice once. I just did what needed to be done, one careful step at a time, because falling apart wasn't an option, and neither was making a scene. This was that kind of angry. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, who has handled my properties for 15 years, picked up on the second ring. I told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Walter, you understand this is your daughter's wedding." I said I understood exactly whose wedding it was. That's precisely why I was doing it. The venue contract, the one Bonnie and Richard Ashford had signed and put a $40,000 non-refundable deposit against, had one clause in it that almost nobody reads, buried on page 14, standard in every single one of my venue contracts because my management company insisted on it after a bad experience years back, with a client who tried to bring in outside vendors that violated our insurance. The clause gives ownership, meaning me, the unilateral right to cancel any booking with full refund of the deposit if the ownership determines in its sole discretion that continuing the booking would not be in the best interest of the venue or its reputation. It's meant for things like a client turning out to be under federal investigation or planning something that violates fire code. It had never once been used. I told Patricia to use it, not out of spite for spite's sake. I want to be honest about my own motives here, because I've turned this over in my head at 3 in the morning more than once since. I didn't do it to hurt Emma. I did it because I could not, physically could not, stand in a suit at the back of a barn I built with these two hands, watching a woman walk my daughter down an aisle in my place, in a building that only existed because of 22 years of my sweat, while my daughter believed that was just easier. If I wasn't going to walk her down the aisle, nobody was going to do it in my house. Patricia drafted the cancellation letter that same afternoon. Full refund issued to Richard Ashford within 5 business days per contract terms, effective immediately, venue no longer available for the date in question. No explanation required under the clause, and I told her not to give one. Let them wonder. I did one more thing that day. I called the management company that runs Grayson Hollow day-to-day and told them if anyone called asking about ownership, to refer all inquiries to Patricia's office. Nothing more. Then I waited. It took 4 days for the fallout to reach me, which honestly is faster than I expected given the size of Ashford family drama typically seems to move. Emma called me on a Tuesday night and I almost didn't answer because I wasn't ready. But I did. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. The venue had canceled. No explanation, just a legal letter and a refund. Bonnie was convinced it was sabotage from someone with a grudge. Richard had gotten his own lawyer involved trying to figure out who owned the LLC behind Grayson Hollow, because the name on the paperwork was just GH Holdings, nothing that would obviously connect to me. They were 7 weeks from the wedding date and had nowhere to hold 200 people. Emma said, through the crying, "Dad, I don't know what to do. Everything is falling apart. Bonnie is losing her mind. Derek's stressed. I don't know who would do this to us." And I sat there for a second, phone against my ear, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, which was not satisfaction. It was grief. Old grief. The kind that never fully leaves, because in that moment all I could hear was Carol's voice in my head asking me what on earth I thought I was doing to our little girl. But I also heard something else. I heard my daughter, for the first time in 8 months, sounding like she needed her father instead of needing me to be quiet and cooperative and out of the way. So I told her the truth. I said, "Emma, I own Grayson Hollow. I've owned it for 11 years. I built it, and I canceled the booking." The silence on the other end of that line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said very quietly, "You did what?" I told her everything. The barn, the years of work, The pond I'd stocked myself. The reason I never told her, because I never wanted her to feel like she was getting a discount or a favor. I wanted her to fall in love with a place on its own merit, which she had, completely by accident, which felt like fate to me at the time. And then I told her about the seating chart and the aisle comment and the attend the reception only phone call and how something in me had simply broken. I said, I wasn't trying to destroy your wedding, sweetheart. I was trying to tell you, the only way I had left, that I built something out of nothing so that you would never have to be small in front of anyone. And I was not going to let it be the backdrop for the first time in your life you let someone make you small. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, Dad, I have to call you back, and hung up. I thought I'd lost her. I really did. I sat in that kitchen and thought I had just done something unforgivable, that I'd let 12 years of careful, patient fathering collapse in one afternoon of pride. Tss. She called back 2 hours later. Her voice was different, steadier. She said she'd gone to Derek, not to Bonnie. She'd sat him down and told him everything. The venue, the ownership, all of it, and asked him one question. Did he know what his mother had been doing to her father for 8 months, piece by piece, and had he ever once stood up about it? Derek, to his credit, apparently sat with that for a long moment and then said no. He hadn't, because he'd been so focused on keeping the peace with his own mother that he never noticed he was asking his fiancée to sacrifice her father to do it. Emma told me that night that she'd made a decision. She didn't want the Ashfords' venue, their guest list, their 80%, or their seating chart anymore. She wanted a small wedding. 50 people. Somewhere that meant something. She asked me if Grayson Hollow was still available for the date. I told her it had never actually been unavailable. It just wasn't available to Bonnie Ashford. The wedding happened 7 weeks later, exactly on schedule, at Grayson Hollow, with 50 guests instead of 200. Richard and Bonnie came considerably quieter than before. Bonnie did not bring up seating charts again. I don't know exactly what Emma or Derek said to her, and I never asked. I walked my daughter down the aisle myself. Past the pond I stocked. Under the beams I put up with my own hands. In the barn I built alone in the years after her mother died, because I needed somewhere to put all that grief, and I didn't know what else to do with it. Emma stopped halfway down the aisle. Completely unplanned, I found out later she hadn't told anyone she was going to do this. Turned to the 50 people sitting there and said, Before we go any further, I want everyone to know that my dad built this place. Every beam, every stone, that pond out there. He built it with his own hands the same years he raised me by himself. I didn't know that until 3 weeks ago, and I have never in my life been more proud to be his daughter. I'm not going to pretend I made it through that part with dry eyes. I didn't. Here's what I've come to believe. Watching this whole thing unfold, people will often tell you exactly how much room they think you deserve to take up in their life, long before they ever say it directly. It shows up in seating charts. It shows up in phone calls that start with, I don't want to fight about this. It shows up in the words, it's just easier. And you have a choice in those moments. You can shrink to fit the space they've offered you, or you can quietly remind them of the size of the thing you actually built. I didn't cancel that venue to punish my daughter. I canceled it because for 8 months, everyone around her had been treating my love for her like a liability to be managed, and I was done being managed. Sometimes the strongest thing a parent can do isn't to keep showing up quietly and taking whatever seat is left at the table. Sometimes it's to remind everyone, gently but unmistakably, exactly whose table it was to begin with. My daughter got married in the barn her father built for her, without ever knowing it was for her, until the day it mattered most. And I got my seat back, not at the head table, at the front, walking her down the aisle, exactly where I belonged all along.